Okay, this is The Grass is Greener on WXRW 104.1 FM in Milwaukee. I am the host of the program, Gary Grass. With me is my co-host, Babette Grill.
Hi, in preparation for the Human Rights Week, we are looking at the campaign Sanctions Kill an Americans Without Sanctions. As part of that appeal, we will have two speakers on today talking about sanctions on Palestine, Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua. And our speakers are Cheryl LaVash of the National Network on Cuba and Barbara Larcom of Nicaragua Coalition. Welcome.
Hello. Okay. So, I don't know what you want to start with about any of this. I mean, this is, we've had at least one show about sanctions before, specifically. We also called UCMs, or Unilateral Coercive Measures. The sanctions regimes we have in this country are just insane. We've got I don't know how many different sanctions laws we have, but we've got 10 different, departments enforcing them all, a lot of them through the Department of Treasury. We've got they've taken down the list of sanctioned countries because they say, well, it's more complicated than that, but they were up to 30 on the list when they took it down. So I don't know. Why don't we start with what are the sanctions that are presently operating against Venezuela and Cuba? Whoever wants to start.
Well, I was going to say before we start with that, could we just mention briefly that Human Rights Week, which is our week of actions next week, is based on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was signed by member countries of the United Nations, starting way back in the late 1940s. And it's celebrated every year on December 10th, and it recognizes the human rights that all people are enshrined with. And there are two sets of them. There's the uh, political and economic rights, and then the more social rights. I think I got that right. Um,
Yeah, yeah.
so in
I'm used to it being just a one-day event, and so I was kind of surprised at the whole week of events. But when I thought of it, I thought, yes, so many human rights are being deprived at this point to so many countries, to so many people.
Exactly. Yes. And so part of the reason that we're doing this week of action is because uh, many of the economic rights in particular are being denied to people through these terrible sanctions, which are imposed now by the US and allied countries on 40 different countries. So that's one third of the world's population.
Right. There's the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and then there's the I think it's International Covenant on Social and Economic Rights. I think if I got those two right. And my recollection is that the U.S. has signed on to one of them, civil and political because its liberal democracy is in there, and the other one is too communistic for us, so we didn't even sign on to that one.
That's right. And so in the meantime, then the U.S. is violating those human rights for many other people around the world.
Yeah,
So
you normally think of these human rights conventions as, in the United States, we look at them as an excuse to intervene, right? I mean, that's a good reason to have a war now is, oh, this country is run by a dictator who's violating the political rights of the people there. It's although it's very selective. The news is as we're recording this right now on December 3rd, there's news leaking through, and this might be wrong because it's you can't trust anything you hear in the first hour, but news of an auto golpe in South Korea, which of course will continue to support South Korea to the hilt because it's a U.S. aligned person that's engaged in this coup. But if some other country were to do something similar, that we was not on our goodie list, right, was on our baddie list, then we'd immediately like look for sanctions. We'd start making war noises, and everything would be falling apart over it. Um, but it's these rights are not intended to be solely to protect people from their own governments. They're to protect people generally from whoever wants to violate their human rights.
Exactly. And so what has been happening then is that these uh, unilateral coercive measures being imposed on governments supposedly around the world are actually harming the people that live in those countries. For example, in Palestine, even before October 7th of last year, there were many coercive measures that were being imposed on Palestine. And so the people were being deprived of clean drinking water, electricity for hospital services, food, medicines were restricted. And in addition, then here in this hemisphere, there are sanctions that are imposed on three countries in particular that we're concerned about, Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. And especially since these countries have recently taken a principled stand in support of uh, the human rights of people in Palestine and trying to stop the genocide underway in Gaza, then even more sanctions are being imposed. It seems like it's a retribution, really.
Well, I mean, let me say, it does isn't just seems like. I mean, you look at some of this legislation, and this is something I've noted on here before. It's like you look at these like bills to enact sanctions against Nicaragua, and they explicitly say that they list all the crimes of Nicaragua, and it's like not supporting U.S. foreign policy in China and Taiwan, not supporting U.S. foreign policy in Russia and Ukraine, right? It's like if you're not allowed to disagree with us on something, right? If they go along with the rest of the world and not with the United States, they go on the sanctions list. It's very, very explicit.
Yeah, that's true. And unfortunately, once again, just I guess last week, President Biden reimposed or um, restated uh, the that Nicaragua is supposedly an extraordinary threat to the security of the United States, which is so utterly ridiculous, considering that Nicaragua's military budget is about half of 1% of its GDP. It has a population of 7 million people, and and it's one of the poorest countries in the hemisphere, and so it's spending its budget on social programs. So the reason that it's a threat to the United States is as a threat of a good example because it's doing wonderful work in the area of providing health care and education to its people universally with no charge. And it's also building up its infrastructure of highways, 24 hospitals. Um, over the past few years since the Sandinistas came back into power. I'm sure Cheryl has some things she'd like to add about Cuba, but that's about Nicaragua.
But these are countries, these three countries are countries that are really trying to provide for the basics of human rights because you can have all the quote unquote democratic rights in the world, but if you don't have enough to eat, if you don't have a house, if you don't have health, health care, if you don't have education, you can't really participate in civil society. So the basic is the economic rights. And one of the subheads of the event on International Human Rights Day is human rights equals the right to live. the basic right to live. And that's one of the things that we're focusing on. Um, and I want to say your program and all the places that Barbara and I are reaching out to, it's really so important because your voices, our voices together are maybe a drop in the bucket, but at least we provide a different um, explanation of what's happening so that the people who are blockaded by the news media that really just wants to give the line about these failed, like Cuba. There's a quote from Fernando Gonzalez, the head of the Cuban Institute of Friendship with the People, that they choke us with one hand, and on the other hand, they're pointing at Cuba and saying it's a failed state. They own reality is that when Obama did those just minimal things, the important one, of course, was reopening diplomatic relations and returning the Cuban Five, which we're going to approach the 10th anniversary of. So it wasn't totally insignificant, but in the scope of the blockade, it wasn't a lot. But even in that short period of time, you could just see so much in Cuba blossoming. And then as soon as the Trump administration came in and socked Cuba with 243 targeted, really surgically targeted sanctions to cut off any way that Cuba had gotten around the blockade up until that point. Um, you see what has happened, and then combined with COVID, where their primary income being from tourism, or a major part of it, was cut off for a whole year. And Cuba has not been able to recover from that, especially with these intensified and the state sponsors of terrorism, which basically makes it impossible to do any international transactions with countries that aren't allied with BRICS. So that's what we're up against. And especially now, this period, whether people think it's possible or not, we continue to pound on the rock and say, Obama.
All right, so I'm gonna restart now. Okay, sorry for cutting you off. We had a technical issue here on this end, and we were not getting through. We could hear you talking, but you couldn't hear us, so we weren't really hosting the program anymore. So we thought we'd just restart and get it going the right way so that we'd be able to participate in the rest of it, because we don't want to miss out. So I apologize for cutting off Cheryl, and I don't know if you have a thought that you wanted to complete before we go on to whatever was next.
You were talking about the sanctions
That
on.
all Biden has to do is send a letter to Congress notifying them, right, Babette, about the state sponsors of terror.
Yeah, that's what you were talking about. I don't know how far we had gotten though before it got cut off. So you
Yeah. Go ahead.
I mean that's a list where they just delegate this huge piece of authority over to the executive branch, where they just they have a bunch of these laws where, like, the president signs off on this, or the attorney general, or the whatever department signs off on them, and then it's like, this becomes an official thing as soon as they're put on the list, and the Congress has basically given up that power to oversee that. Just sort of said, you decide who you want to put on the list. We're not going to interfere. Foreign policy, we think, is a president thing. So yeah, in those cases, there's no legislation. It's really simple. The president can just decide to do it or not do it. Just like when they renewed the the annual renewal of the state of emergency that's existed for, he did this for all these different countries. I mean, we're still, every year we certify that we're still at war with North Korea, and and it's like, sure enough, every year the president just does it. But anytime they wanted to, they could just simply stop doing those things, and wouldn't need any sort of legislation. All these conditions would just end.
Is that your understanding of it, or do they need to send a letter to Congress to at least make it official?
Not to put countries on the list. No, that is,
to take
just
them
the
off the
president.
list.
But to get off the list, there are two ways to do it. One is a congressional way of doing it, and the other one is a letter by the president to Congress notifying them that in 45 days he will or they will remove that country off the list. Biden could have done it, right at the beginning of his, presidency, because he can rely on what the research that the Obama administration had done, certifying that Cuba was not a threat, and actually that regulation is you're only certifying that for the past 6 months this country has not engaged in terrorist activity, whatever that might be.
If he does it right now, and I don't think he will, but if he would do it right now, would there be enough time for them to get off the list? And also, do you think Trump would just put them right back on?
Well, I think it really depends on where Trump's priorities are, when when he takes office on the 20th, whether Cuba winds
it
up
seems
high on that list.
it
Go
seems
ahead,
really
Barbara.
important for all of us to speak out strongly. And so that's one reason that next week there's going to be a rally, especially demanding that Biden take Cuba off of the state sponsors of terrorism list, in hopes that if we all speak out enough, that the people in government in the next administration will pay attention to that. Um, that's the hope, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to say, the requirement that there be some sort of, realistic basis for whatever certification that they make. I mean, that's completely, theoretical. It's not real. I mean, they constantly put these countries on the list with like the no real basis at all. They just, they make something up and they put it on a piece of paper, and that's all it takes. And if they wanted to remove anyone off of any of these lists, all they'd have to do is just say they want them removed. There's nothing else that's in the law would stand in their way from just doing it. It's always just been purely political to put someone on the list, take them off the list, and that goes for, not just the state sponsors of terrorism list, but, all these other certifications that they make. Those things are so manipulated. There's like, if they have some sort of actual evidence or basis, they'll throw it in there, but they don't need it. They'll just keep on doing it regardless of what the evidence shows.
Right. And
And
there's
the harm is just tremendous. Cuba is really suffering right now. I mean, Cheryl, you can probably say more about this, but people are actually going hungry for the first time in a long time in Cuba.
Well, it's really true. Their electrical grid, is, really needs to be completely revamped. Um, Cuba can't buy anything that has more than 10% components made in the United States. The United States corporations have bought up subsidiaries that make medical supplies and things all around the world, that puts them, out of the possibility of Cuba buying them. And then there's this over compliance. Everybody's so afraid that they're gonna
Yeah.
run afoul of this web, this really incomprehensible web of laws and regulations and executive orders and all that.
Yeah, yeah.
But they say, why should I take the risk?
I mean, the law is a mess, and that leads to overcompliance.
Mhm.
But I mean, I should say, I mean, I was on a webinar about free speech maybe a month ago, and one of the points that they made very strongly is that, if you go after the speaker, then you're just going after the speech, right? But if you go after the bank that processes the credit card transaction, that processes the website's transaction, that goes after the speaker, then you've got like 4 layers of overcompliance attached to that, right? So every step along the path, there's a party that will overcomply because they don't want to even have like a complaint that'll possibly get them in trouble and get things suspended and lead to legal action. So one step up overcomplies a little bit, the next step up overcomplies a little more, the next step up overcomplies even more. So you wind up with this massive overcompliance. And when it comes to something like Cuba, right, or Venezuela, these sanctions, they all have secondary components, right? So it's not just we go after Cuba for this, right? It's always we go after some other country or some other bank or some other place or thing that facilitated a transaction with Cuba, right? Or facilitated a transaction with Venezuela. So, it's not just like Cuba wants to overcomply so they can meet the sanctions, right, and not get into trouble and not give the U.S. an excuse. It's some bank somewhere that's going to face $1 billion fine if one of their transactions sneaks through that has someone to do with Cuba in it, and they wind up being like indirectly responsible. So they wind up having this really huge clampdown that anything that even comes remotely close will be eliminated. And so you've got things that might not theoretically be on the sanctions list, right? There might be some sort of medical exemption or something like that, but it doesn't really matter because someone is going to overcomply because we can't. There's nothing on the other end to force them to comply if it's something medical or something, something like food. That's just the way the law works. It's designed to go broader than the literal scope of what's written.
Yeah. Like Fernando said, they're choking us with one hand and with the other hand saying, oh, look, you failed. And what Barbara was saying is so true. The cost to the people. I mean, Cuba's had one of the lowest infant mortalities for many, many years now, much lower than in the United States. And its infant mortality is rising because of the conditions that people are faced with. Cuba had to a big thing in Cuba in the morning is bread, that people go out to the bakery and they get bread. Well, the size of the loaf has been reduced because it's so difficult to get flour. Those are, just some of the real tangible problems that Cuba's facing. They're still doing the best they can to make sure that everybody gets enough calories to survive, but it's more and more difficult. In addition to that, the medicines, trying to get the raw materials for them to develop the medicines that they actually produce is difficult. Oil, like you say, okay, well, here's Mexico, here's Venezuela. They are, oh, gee.
They're petroleum exporting countries.
Right, that are nearby. But what has happened with that, I have no idea what this is. I have a do not disturb here. Sorry about that. You would think, okay, well, it's not that far for them to get oil, but you need a tanker, and that tanker needs to be insured. So after President Obama said that Venezuela was an existential threat to the United States, which opened the door to they were nice with Cuba, but then they went after Venezuela, which really was a stab in the back at Cuba. And Venezuela then, whenever they tried to ship oil, any tankers couldn't get insurance. They would interdict them at sea. They stole a whole tanker of oil, not to mention all the other stuff that was stolen from Venezuela, all the gold that was
Yeah.
held in banks.
Yeah.
So
UK stole a big ton of gold, and we basically stole Citgo. And
yeah,
those are the two greatest thefts. Other than basically the theft of all the Venezuelans that have been killed as a result of all the sanctions. I mean, I
right.
remember it was a long time ago. CEPR, CEPR. I forgot what it stands for, but they produced their report that said there had been they estimated 40,000 Venezuelans had been killed as a result of sanctions, and that was a long time ago. And that number has not been frozen at that point, right? So you have these kind of zombie numbers that keep floating around. You see this in Gaza too, where it's like you keep on seeing the death toll from 6 months ago continually circulated, like no one has perished in the last 6 months in Gaza, which is just absurd. So, but yeah, no, these things are really devastating, and and again, I mean, the United States, you talk about how the importance of food, right? Freedom for a lot of people means food, right? A lot of people will, around the world have been willing over and over and over to give up their right to free speech or right to own a gun or right to not have the military quartered in their home, whatever, in exchange for the right to eat, right? The right to eat is very, very important to a lot of people. And that's that type of thing, right? The basic right to life, right? The right to the essentials of living, is something that's in the these social and economic covenant that we do not recognize here because it's just too socialistic for us. And it's something that it's in Roosevelt's Four Freedoms, right? Freedom from want, right? But we legally do not respect Roosevelt's Four Freedoms, and we do not allow the rest of the world to enjoy those four freedoms. We are anti-freedom in that sense. We are not big on the freedoms from. We are big on the freedom to, as long as you can afford it. And the end of rant.
Well, just to add to your rant a little bit, yes, I think what many people in the United States don't realize either is that people who become desperate for food and other sustenance of life end up at our borders trying to get in here because they see that we are not suffering economically in the same way. And so then people here not really understanding that U.S. policy has driven people to our borders, then are trying to punish them more by not letting them in or punishing them in so many different ways once they get here.
Yeah, and in a way, this entire xenophobic political moment where everyone's enraged about the border, may perversely have some positive effect, because if you stake your entire political reputation on not having immigration here, and then you have policies that promote lots of immigration here, and you can't really do anything effectively to stop it, there's going to be a lot of pressure to do something that would actually work, right? I think so. That's the very optimistic take on a very pessimistic situation, I think.
I view that they will take that the Trump administration, we can see that the Biden administration hasn't done anything good, but the Trump administration will even go farther and overreact to immigrants coming here and say, oh, well, we have to, maybe invade someplace to get them to stop sending their immigrants or something, something ridiculous like that.
we're going to punish their economies and therefore like end immigration by like making those countries suffer, right? Do something about the immigration or we'll make you suffer. It's like, well, the more you make us suffer, the more people are going to leave the country and try to go to your country. That's just how it works, you know. So, yeah, I think there's a natural contradiction in that, and there's a huge problem with the way this administration is going to try to approach things. And um, you know, if we're lucky, that will blow up in a good way, and if we're unlucky, it'll blow up in a bad way. But it's not going to succeed the way, you know, the Trump people think it's going to succeed, because that's just not in the cards. Like that's just not, you know, possible. It's like they're basing everything on like a very distorted view of reality, and that's going to come back and have some sort of effect, and we'll see what that is.
Well,
Would it
remember,
be okay?
Yeah.
go,
Would it
go
be
ahead.
okay? Would it be okay if we talk a little bit about the activities of next week? We want to make sure that we get those
100%.
publicized a little bit.
Absolutely. While we're waiting for Cheryl, why don't you just let us know a little bit more about the planned activities for Human Rights Week?
Sure. Okay. Well, first of all, on Human Rights Day itself, December 10th, in the evening, there is going to be a hybrid, meaning in person and online, forum on human rights. And that's going to feature diplomats from three Latin American countries and representatives of the Sanctions Kill Americas Without Sanctions campaign and the Zone of Peace campaign and the International Tribunal. That particular forum will start at 6:30 in person and 7 o'clock online. And you can find the links to register to that for either in person or online at sanctionskill.org. So just look there for the week of actions and you'll find the registration. The forum itself is going to focus on human rights in Palestine, Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela specifically, and how those sanctions have harmed the people in those countries and what we can do to try to get those revoked. We all join together, linking hands. So that forum is being sponsored by quite a number of different organizations and coalitions. Then the next day, called Advocacy Day, there's going to be a petition delivery to Congress. And by the way, you can sign that petition on the same website that I just mentioned. Just look for the petition link there. And please do sign that
That
both as
was what? Again,
the petition against sanctions, uh,
Oh,
especially.
I think she wants you to say the website again.
Oh, sorry, sanctionskill.org.
Okay.
Yes.
And speaking of joining together, 5 seconds after you started talking, Cheryl did join us, so she's here. So welcome back, Cheryl.
Thank you.
Great. That's good because I wasn't seeing Cheryl. I was on the other page reading reading some of the information. Yeah, so just to continue then on December 11th with Advocacy Day. So we're hoping that everyone, both as individuals and organizations, will sign the petition against these sanctions. And these are focused specifically on three countries in the Western Hemisphere, um, Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua, ending those sanctions. And so there's going to be a delivery to Congress with those petitions and pointing out to Congress how many people signed from each state in the United States in particular. There's also going to be a rally in front of the White House to tell the Biden administration to remove Cuba from the state sponsors of terrorism list. So all that is happening then on December 11th. And you can find more information about various events during the week, and you can even sponsor your own local events in support of all this and sign up for that on the same web page. Thanks.
All right. Well, thank you.
All right.
And you can also join there will be a virtual participation in the event on the 10th of December too. And you can get that link where is it? On the site?
It's on the same page.
Yeah.
Sanctionskill.org.
Correct.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so do we want to talk about any other sanctions in any other countries? I mean, I know that this is sort of your specialty, and I think it's really important the ones that we have in this hemisphere, right? But I mean, there's I mean, I don't know if maybe we should talk about Nicaragua a little more first before we go on anywhere else. I mean, I'm obviously concerned about all the sanctions we have all around the world because we have so many different countries that we are exposing to these sanctions. And like I said before, they took down the list from like whatever government website it was when they like I think they just ran out of space for more countries is what happened, right? But let us know a little bit more about the effects in Nicaragua because I think that's another big one right now.
Okay. Well, one thing I'll mention, because you mentioned already overcompliance, and this has had its effect in Nicaragua as well. The United States contacted the IMF and World Bank and said, don't give any more loans to Nicaragua, don't give them any more aid. And this was over the 5 years starting in 2018 when there was the attempted coup in Nicaragua. And so not only for I guess you'd call it normal loans, they were able to impose that. But even in the case when there was supposed to be humanitarian aid to the country, for example, after COVID happened and it really hit the economies of many countries around the world very hard, but it hit Nicaragua hard as well. And so they were supposed to be exempt from any kind of sanctions having to do with humanitarian aid, but they still did not get any help from the IMF and World Bank during that period, even for that. And according to the finance minister at that time, Ivan Acosta, he estimated that during the 5 years starting 2018, that Nicaragua, which had a very good credit rating with both of these institutions, normally it would have expected to get a total of about 2.5 to $3 billion in development funding from those two bodies. But instead, they got maybe 10% of that amount in total.
Right.
And
Yeah. One of the things you're referring to is what are called SDRs or special drawing rights. The International Monetary Fund gave out the better part of $1 trillion to countries to help with COVID. And, there were some campaigns around, loosening up the special drawing rights for certain countries that were being discriminated against on that list. And that Nicaragua was one of those.
yeah, that's right. Um, I am not expert in talking about sanctions on other countries around the world, but I know, for example, that Syria was very harshly affected by such sanctions. And of course, there's a terrible situation going on there right now. Cheryl, do you want to speak any more to other countries?
Well, I think Venezuela, because there's a lot of unclarity. Um, there are some people who are, trying to dispute the election and are winding up a little bit on the
setting
side
up
of the
almost
US.
a Guaido 2.0 type of thing, where the
Exactly.
U.S. claims to just appoint a president.
Yeah.
Exactly. And everything that 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 leads up to. And we've seen the kinds of violence. We saw the guarimbas during the 2014, 2015. We've seen the efforts at assassination and economic sabotage of their electrical grid. And nonetheless, they are working really hard to build, continue to build housing, make sure that people aren't being starved by sanctions. They're, developing, and I think a lot of it has to do with the development that's happened in Nicaragua and the experiences and development that happened there.
Yeah,
And
I think that all of these countries that are much stronger for having each other in the world. Both because there's lessons in how to do it, and just because there's certain strength in numbers where the U.S. Well, the U.S. does try to attack everyone at once, right? It's just, there is such a large sanctioned community right now at some point we're going to reach the critical mass where we are sanctioning more places than we're not sanctioning, and all the sanctioned countries are going to have this great internal economy among with each other that it like excludes us, and we'll be the people that are losing out the most on the sanctions. In fact, we already suffer greatly from the sanctions that we impose on other countries. There's a lot of blowback from the sanctions. There's a lot of just direct harm to the United States. If you tell our businesses that we can't do business with this country, that country, we lose out on a lot of trade. And the theory is it's always going to hurt the other country more than it hurts us. But we've seen these things backfire over and over and over, where the other country decides, well, you know what? I mean, if you take a little country that's in this hemisphere, like in Nicaragua, right? They have a lot of trade with the U.S., right? Because we're close, right? We do this to Cuba. They're very close. They're natural trading partners of the United States. They're just offshore, right? Before the revolution, all the trade was with the U.S., right? They had all the U.S. stuff there that they've been losing. They haven't had the spare parts for now for 60, 70 years, right? But if you try to go after a country like Russia or China with sanctions, it's like they just like, okay, fine, we don't need you, and we lose out tremendously. And this, the last 40 years, I mean, the last 2 years especially, we've seen this effort to sanction Russia that's been an absolute failure. Russia's thriving, and who suffers? Europe has been like, they can't get Russian energy, right? It's been good for selling U.S., liquefied natural gas over there, but it's been horrible for the people in Europe. And now Trump is coming in talking about these huge tariffs that he wants to enact on like all the BRICS countries, and particularly on China. And it's like, that does not lead anywhere well for the United States. So it's like this whole, I mean, I'm more concerned about sanctions when they hit one of these small countries that are really, really harmed, and lots of people die and suffer from them. But I think there's a strong political argument against sanctions that, like, look, these backfire all the time. They're often just very stupid policy that hurts the U.S. more than the people we're intending to hurt. I mean, it hurts everybody, but it hurts us the most sometimes.
and
Yes,
I'll
that
add to that.
certainly is.
yeah,
I'll add to that just that it hurts our farmers. I know here in Wisconsin, they would love to be able to send grain in that to places like Cuba, but they can't. And it's because of our sanctions. And the other thing is, I think a lot of countries often will, just out of necessity, try growing their own things and really becoming just independent. And I think Nicaragua has done some of that, right?
Yes, and well, you're referring indirectly. I don't think you mentioned the name BRICS yet, but the formation of an alliance among various countries, an economic alliance, including the BRICS countries plus 4 new ones that have been added to the list. So 9 altogether so far. And Venezuela and Nicaragua have both applied to be members of BRICS. Venezuela is coming closer, but it was rejected this time. But yes, they're very interested in being part of any alliance that might be a way of working around the sanctions if they're having trouble with any kind of economic partnership with the U.S. So yes, it is harmful to the U.S.'s economy, especially over the longer term.
I mean, I did mention BRICS, and collectively they're 35% of the world's economy. I mean, it's like that is a huge chunk of the world to decide that we're going to sanction, right? We rely so much on inputs from those countries. There are so many things that are components in our products that are part of our supply chain. We rely on those countries as markets. We get oil from some of those countries, or at least we want to control their oil because it competes with our exports, and we do have this relationship with foreign oil. It's kind of complicated, but anyway.
It's a way that things are becoming clearer to more people. I mean, a lot of these ideas, I'm sure, Gary, you and Babette have had for a long time. You've seen what's coming. But for many people in our neighborhoods, they don't necessarily, or they haven't necessarily seen things in this way, that in fact it's hurting us, it's hurting our communities. We're paying the price for these policies that the government is putting into effect. People in the United States don't support a blockade of Cuba. They don't know much about it, but we've been able to get 116 resolutions passed in elected bodies and unions across the country. And so people are not, and people are going. More and more people are going to Cuba. Hopefully, we'll be going to, well, Venezuela is a little harder, but going to Nicaragua, going to Venezuela, finding ways to see the reality for themselves and bring those stories back. Because we know people go to Cuba, and it's like, I mean, even Cubans, children of Cuban emigres who are hostile to the Cuban government, have gone there and come back and said, it's not like what my family said it was.
Right. Well, I know, no, I think that's really important. There has been, and I've been noticing this now for 10 or 20 years, that there's been this generational shift. The primary energy behind wanting to sanction Cuba, it basically comes from the Cuban emigre lobby and from like a small cabal of really kind of radical neoconservatives that have this foreign policy agenda, right? But this the old generation was like wanted to go back and get their mansions back, and just really thought they were going to go back and the revolution would be over tomorrow. And now we're like generations on into the Cuban Revolution, and it's that's never coming back. And the people that have grown up in the United States, for their whole lives, like they don't want to go back to Cuba and like try to retake the things that were expropriated back in 1959. I mean, that's just ridiculous. I mean, their lives are here, and it's they have an entirely different way of looking at this, which is, I mean, a lot of them are still very, very radical based on what they've been told by their families, but it's like there has been this like rule breakdown. It used to be very, very monolithic in the Cuban community, and now it's much more divided. And you see very similar things in other kinds of immigrant communities too. I mean, Jewish Americans right now, when it comes to Israel, there's been a huge shift from like being, like very much like all in line with the Israel lobby to now like being very, very, very divided. And we're going to have
And
we're going to
they're
have we're going to have a
concerned
guest
some,
next week from Jewish
right,
Voice for Peace, and
right,
we'll
Right.
talk about that a little more. But it's like,
concerned on Gaza.
yeah, there's been, but even before Gaza, there's been this generational shift, and I think that's one of the things that brings hope. I mean,
It is positive.
we have a right now a gerontocracy of these, like, all these senators out in there that are like in their 70s and 80s, and we have all sorts of like very conservative people in the academy and in government that their time is running out, and the young people just do not see things the same way. And so there is a lot of hope coming up. Even though we have a really, in some ways, a very, very dismal situation around the world. I mean, I think there is a lot of hope out there. So don't want to be completely all doom and gloom, because there is change visible on the horizon, and it might be much closer than we think.
And that's why what we're doing in Washington this coming week, it also coincides with other petitions. There's a move on petition again, to get Cuba off the list. There's a DSA Cuba committee that is doing a petition to Biden on the same thing, humanitarian aid, get Cuba off the list. And they have gotten, for example, the United Auto Workers International Executive Board to sign on to that, in addition to like 50 elected officials. So it's building, the pressure's building, the call, the awareness that sanctions and like you said, the tariffs. I mean, really, the tariffs are another form of sanction, and they're talking about sanctioning Mexico and Canada.
Yeah,
What's that going to mean? The auto workers in Germany
we should
are on
completely cut
strike.
off Mexico and Canada from any trade with the United States.
Detroit's going to be in trouble.
We'll show them. Well, yeah, I mean,
So,
that's where all the U.S. automakers are. They're all of their factories in Mexico anyway. If we can't import them, then we can't import Ford and Chevy here, right? Um,
So we've got to, be able to show the links between all of these things and how it's really in our interest as working people, as ordinary people across this country, to really change the course. Um, it, it's really scary what's coming, but there are a lot of opportunities in it as well if we keep fighting.
No, that's a very good point. Um,
so
I
kind of,
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, kind of in summarizing what we've said so far, I guess, about sanctions and about blowback, that sanctions drive immigrants to our borders. And also, they harm not only the economies of the countries being sanctioned, but also our economy in many different ways that we've discussed here. And we haven't even exactly mentioned too much, but they're just wrong. They're immoral, they're harming
right.
people, and they violate people's human rights, which is not what we want.
And one final thing, which is not the most important thing, but it's like, in any effort to try to like have any sort of foreign policy at all, right? That's anything that's based on actual diplomacy. If anyone knows what that is anymore in this country, because is a thing for other people in the world. But the mask has just fallen off the United States so badly. We've always had this like big machine of like talking about human rights and talking about democracy and freedom and all this other stuff. And it's like, now Trump just comes into office and it's very, very single-minded. America first. We're gonna do whatever suits the United States. The way we're treating Israel, Gaza is like woke up the rest of the world that this what rules-based international order that we keep touting is just do whatever benefits the U.S. or whatever the U.S. wants you to do. It has
Right.
nothing to do with any sort of rules or any sort of order or any sort of anything positive at all. It's just like you just want us to be, following you everywhere you want to do, and just let you do everything and have you be the boss. It's like I don't want you to be the boss. And we thought you were arguing from some sort of principles, and the principles are gone. That was all a mask, and everyone is seeing through it now. And I think there's some advantage to the United States. If we wanted to do something in the world that would be positive, we would like to have a little bit of credibility. And I think from our perspective, it's kind of a good thing that the credibility is destroyed. But there's an argument also that says, well, we shouldn't do all this stuff that completely destroys our credibility, because we might actually want to do something good in the world someday, and we should try to like at least pretend to behave, right? Have some reasonable argument to, and this just shows off how terrible we are. So it's like, I don't know.
Yeah, but don't take that on. It's not us.
Yeah. That's true. That's but it's an argument for the other side. It's an argument that supports our position. You shouldn't do this because it weakens the United States, right? It weakens our side, it weakens their side too. It's like, if it's in no one's interest, but then maybe some small group that has an interest in it, that profits from it. There's always some small group that profits from it. But showing the other side that they are not that group, that they're not in that group that benefits from this, is a tool. So,
Yeah.
All right. I don't know if we have any time left. I want to thank you both for being here. I apologize for the technological issue earlier, and I thank you for sticking with us, even though we had a problem before. And it's been really nice having you both.
I did want to ask if you are aware of, or if your groups are a part of, on December 7th, even, kind of just leading up to or before the events of Human Rights Week, there will be at the National Press Club a whole series of speakers that Scott Ritter is hosting, basically saying that if we don't deal with the nuclear issue and trying to get back to nuclear
Détente,
Yeah.
some treaties again,
Right.
we're all going to get blown up, and then all the sanctions aren't going to matter, so...
Yeah, and so there is that on December 7th. I don't have a link for that just off the top of my head, but I just thought I'd ask if you were part of that in any way.
This particular campaign is not part of that, but some of our members are attending that, in fact. For example, I know Jerry Condon from Veterans for Peace is attending that. And it does sound very interesting. I hope we'll hear back some reports from that soon.
All right. Well, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you again for being on the show, and love to have you back anytime.
Thank you for the opportunity.
And we'll spread the link.
All right, thank you. All right.
Thanks.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.